So there were two cases that the Supreme Court combined into one to make a decision on this. Okay, so the first one was Net Choice versus Paxton, and the second one, Moody versus Net Choice. Now, both cases stemmed from Republican governors creating laws to prevent social media companies from censoring conservatives and conservative speech online. So Net Choice versus Paxton is a dispute over Texas law HB 20, which aimed to prevent large social media platforms with over 50 million monthly active users from banning individuals or moderating content based on political viewpoints. And it required these platforms to disclose their content moderation policies and report on the content removed. Now, Ken Paxton is the Attorney General of Texas defending the state law. Paxton's argument was that the law was necessary to prevent censorship of conservative viewpoints by large tech companies. Now, Net Choice is an industry trade group representing Amazon, Google, Meta, Twitter, eBay, PayPal, and Airbnb. And Net Choice advocates for less government regulation of online businesses. Now, Net Choice argued that Texas law was a violation of their First Amendment rights. So they claim that HB 20 infringes on the free speech rights of private companies, forcing them to publish content that they might find objectionable. They also argued the law was vague and overly broad, potentially leading to inconsistent enforcement and chilling effects on content moderation. So Ken Paxton, arguing for Texas, argued that the law was designed to protect free speech by preventing viewpoint discrimination on major social media platforms. He also argued social media companies are like common carriers or public utilities, suggesting they should be subject to similar regulations to ensure fair access. So I just want to point something out real quickly, which you already know, but this argument is coming from a Republican under a Republican governor. And it's quite interesting that they're using the public utility argument, because that is something that people historically on the left would argue about social media companies, while the right historically argued that these are private entities able to do whatever they want. So initially, a federal district court blocked HB 20, agreeing with Net Choice that the law likely violated the First Amendment rights of the social media companies. But then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals lifted the district court's injunction, allowing the law to take effect while the case continued on to the Supreme Court. Now let's go over Moody versus Net Choice. Now this case involves, it's very similar, but this case involves a Florida law signed by Governor Ron DeSantis in May of 2021. And the law is aimed at preventing these large social media companies from deplatforming political candidates. So Net Choice again argued that this law infringed upon the First Amendment rights of the social media companies. And Moody, representing Florida, maintained that the law was designed to prevent censorship of conservative viewpoints and ensure that social media platforms act as neutral conduits for information. So they were protecting the free speech rights of individuals and Republican politicians. Now, a federal district court in Florida blocked the law, ruling that it likely violated the First Amendment and expressed concerns about the law's vagueness and the burden it placed on interstate commerce. This time, however, unlike the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals largely upheld the district court's injunction, agreeing that the law likely infringed on the First Amendment rights of social media companies. However, the court did allow some provisions related to transparency to stand, because both states wanted these social media companies to be more transparent about why are they removing certain people, what are their rules and regulations or community guidelines and whatnot. So 11th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that part, but they said, no, we're not going to allow this law to go forward. Well, the Supreme Court, they decided to combine the two cases and rule on them together. Well, what did they decide? That's the big question now. And the ruling just came out the other day. All 9 justices in a 9-0 decision decided to kick the case back to the lower courts. But what was significant are some of the opinions of the justices. So the majority opinion was written by Kagan. She was joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Sotomayor, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. And Justice Jackson joined in only on parts of the opinion. Now, Justices Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch agreed to kick the case back, but they wanted everyone to know that they had different reasons and pointed out their differences. Mostly, Kagan and Cruz seemed to lean towards agreeing with Net Choice. Kagan even stated that social media companies should be treated the same way as traditional news publishers and that they can curate their content without the government intervening, while Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch seemed to lean towards disagreeing with them. Now, this has been consistent in other free speech cases that have been brought before the court, including Missouri versus Biden, where those three same justices disagreed with the opinion and felt that these cases are extremely important towards an individual's free speech rights, while the other justices have seemed to protect the corporations and the government. So it's important to note that they haven't ruled on any of these cases, not on these cases that they combined, nor on Missouri versus Biden or any of the other free speech cases as of late. It just seems like the Supreme Court doesn't want to tackle the challenges the internet brings to our lives. Now, where it gets interesting is the reaction from both sides of the aisle. Basically, there's 4 different reactions to this ruling, 2 coming from conservatives and 2 coming from liberals. Of course, there's nuanced little reactions, but those are the main 4, okay? These different reactions show just how things politically have begun to flip and change and morph, and it's hard to know what side actually stands for what anymore. The conservative side is pretty straightforward. So these 2 cases were brought forward by Republican governors who are seeing liberal big tech companies censor conservatives, so they're trying to protect conservatives. However, there are other Republicans who are more traditional, and they believe that businesses should be completely unregulated and separate from the government and from any sort of government interference. So these 2 camps right now are having it out. One side saying we need to protect our values, and that value includes the First Amendment. And the other side saying, yeah, we need to protect our values, and that value includes less government intervention. So this shift inside of the Republican Party, where more people are starting to favor government regulation to protect things like free speech, has been really fascinating to watch. Ideas about protecting free speech that's unpopular and wanting to treat social media companies like public utilities have been ideas typically coming from leftists. There's also the argument about states' rights. So there are some of the Republicans out there who are saying, okay, it's okay that government regulates, so as long as the regulations are coming from the state and not the feds. But the other conservatives are saying this is a slippery slope, and you start with some government and you end up with a lot of government. And that's pretty much the infighting that's going on the conservative side. It's pretty clear cut. Where things get weird is on the liberal side. There's basically no liberal right now advocating for First Amendment rights and free speech. Okay, they all seem to want censorship. They just disagree on who should regulate it. So some want speech regulated by the government. Others want speech regulated by the social media companies, and they want them to be free to do that. But none of them are arguing whether or not speech should be regulated. Some liberals are upset over this ruling because they believe it signals a win for the big tech companies when they want the government to be able to control the big tech companies to combat misinformation and quote unquote protect users, right? Protected democracy is another one they often use. Others view this as a win because they want social media companies to be doing more curation of content in order to combat misinformation and people they don't like. And they see the justice's ruling as signaling to social media companies that they can act as editors rather than as public utilities. And the liberals are liking that actually this time around. So one saying, oh, it's a loss because the government really needs to be, they're favoring social media companies and we want the government to be able to censor people. And the other side saying, no, it's a win because now social media companies are going to be able to censor people, but it's all yay censorship, okay? Then you have the arguments being made by, for example, those at The Nation, which is historically a very progressive left-leaning outlet, saying the Supreme Court kicking the case back keeps the door open for the government getting in there and moderating content. They want government intervention, but not in the same way conservatives want it, right? So conservatives want to use the government to prevent social media companies from banning content. And these liberals want to use the government to force the social media companies to ban content. And then you have this opinion piece in the New York Times, which while I agree with one major point in this piece, the rest of it just showcases what liberals are really hoping to accomplish, which is government censorship and regulation. Let me read this to you. This is written by Tim Wu. Tim Wu is a law professor at Columbia who writes often about big tech. He served on the National Economic Council as a special assistant to the president for competition and tech policy from 2021 to 2023. He has been an advisor to both the Obama and the Biden administration. So this guy's coming from the left. And he's a law professor at Columbia University, so he's on the left, okay? So he writes, this is his editorial opinion piece. This is pissing off a lot of liberals. The title being, "The Net Choice Decision Shows the First Amendment is Out of Control." Now, I agree with him on one point, and let me get to what that point is. He says, the First Amendment was written in the 18th century with the noble and vitally important goal of ensuring robust political debate and a free press. For much of American history, First Amendment cases involving speech typically concerned political dissenters, religious outcasts, intrepid journalists, and others whose ability to express their views was threatened by a powerful and sometimes overbearing state. The First Amendment was a tool that helped the underdog. It should help all dogs, underdog, big dog, mean dog, small dog, nice dog, any dog, right? It should help everybody. The First Amendment should be for all. But yes, he's right in that the point of having it was you don't need to protect the big dog, the mean dog, right? The big bad dog. You don't have to protect that one. You do have to protect the underdog. So that is why the First Amendment is there. He says, but sometime in this century, the judiciary lost the plot. Judges have transmuted a constitutional provision meant to protect unpopular opinion into an all-purpose tool of legislative nullification that now mostly protects corporate interests. Now, this is where I agree with him. I agree, actually, that the First Amendment is out of control, but only because I believe that it has gone out of control to a point where it no longer actually protects our free speech rights as individuals, but that, as he mentions, it does protect the rights, the free speech rights of corporations and non-human entities. He says, Monday's Supreme Court decision. So he's saying sometime this century, the judiciary lost the plot. What should have been to protect unpopular opinion now mostly protects corporate interests. Nearly any law that has to do with the movement of information can be attacked in the name of the First Amendment. Monday's Supreme Court decision in the two net choice cases greatly adds to the problem. He says, while the Supreme Court remanded both cases to the lower courts for further factual development, the court nonetheless went out of its way to state that the millions of algorithmic decisions made every day by social media platforms are protected by the First Amendment. It did so by blithely assuming that those algorithmic decisions are equivalent to the expressive decisions made by human editors at newspapers. That is, he's referring to Kagan's opinion where she says, hey, you know what, social media companies are basically just like, and this is where things get really dangerous because we'll get into Section 230, but she says, this is really, they're really like newspapers. And since they're like newspapers, newspapers can, they don't have to print everything you send them, right? They can curate and edit. And that's what social media companies are like. They're like newspapers. And so we're now infringing on their First Amendment rights by telling them what they can and cannot publish in their newspaper. That would be a total and complete infringement when it comes to news. If the government were to come to tell me, for example, Kim, this is what you have to talk about and this is what you can't talk about, then that would be an infringement on my company, I suppose, not just me as an individual, but on my company. If I had, let's say, I only do this one show, but let's say I had multiple shows and multiple hosts and, I was a news organization and they came to me and said, you can't, you and your other hosts can't talk about these particular subjects and you must cover these other things. That would totally be an infringement on the First Amendment of the company. So I recognize the need for some protection for companies when it comes to First Amendment rights. But what the Supreme Court essentially said in this decision, even though they kicked the case back to the courts and they're not really making a decision, the reason why Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas wrote a dissenting opinion on this, even though they all agreed 9-0 to kick this case back, was because they wanted to make the point of they don't agree with that sentiment of the majority of basically algorithmic, algorithms and content curation on social media sites using these computers is the same as you and I having First Amendment free speech rights. They're saying, no, come on, guys. And I agree with them. No, come on, guys. That can't possibly be where we're headed with this. So he says, even if one has concerns about the wisdom and questionable constitutionality of the Florida and Texas laws, as I do, he says, now I don't as much as he does. He says, the breadth of the court's reasoning should serve as a wake-up call. The judiciary needs to realize that the First Amendment is spinning out of control. It is beginning to threaten many of the essential, now this is where I don't agree with him. He says it's beginning to threaten many of the essential jobs of the state, such as protecting national security and safety and privacy of its citizens. So he's saying it's out of control because they've now basically ripped power away from the government and given it all to these private corporations. And now there's no, the government is like hamstrung, is what he's basically arguing. Now, I argue that it's out of control but for different reasons. Not because, oh, I want more government intervention and the government can't do anything because they're hamstrung by these rulings that just protect the corporations. I say that these rulings that continually protect the corporations and that rule that corporations' speech and money spending and their ability to have, like porn on the internet all over the place, like all of these have been argued under First Amendment, and they're not in the spirit anymore of what the First Amendment was meant to be for, which is protecting our ability to speak up against the man. And instead, they've created a situation where people are suffering. The very people who were supposed to be protected by the First Amendment are now harmed by these expansions of what free speech means. He says, how do we get here? I agree with him on this, how we got to this point. He says the reach of the First Amendment started to expand in the 60s and 70s, when the Supreme Court issued a series of rulings that held that the First Amendment concerned not just political and religious speech, but also other forms of expression such as sexual content, commercial communication, such as advertisements. These initial changes to the scope of the First Amendment were reasonable. Over the past decade or two, however, liberal as well as conservative judges and justices have extended the First Amendment to protect nearly anything and everything that could be called speech, regardless of its value or whether the speaker is human or a corporation, or in the future, AI. It has come to protect corporate donations to political campaigns like Citizens United versus the FEC in 2010, the buying and tracking of data, Sorrell versus IMS Health in 2011, even outright lies, United States versus Alvarez in 2012. As a result, it has become harder for the government to protect its citizens. I don't really care about the government protecting the citizens. That's where I disagree with him once again. But I do agree that all of these subsequent rulings that have basically said, like Citizens United, which now we have a political class that has run amok, and all they do is take a bunch of money, and we're seeing the effects of that. They don't represent the people anymore. They only represent those who give them tons of money. And because of Citizens United, they're allowed to give them loads and loads and loads of money. And not just Citizens United, but the ruling after Citizens United, which actually allowed for super PACs, was even more consequential. So you've got tracking of data. There's a variety of things out there that have been totally against the people, and instead for these big corporations, for surveillance, for rotting our culture, the demise of the family, the demise of healthy sexual development, I would say, in youth, with porn being all over the place. There's a lot of things there that they've said, these are all protected under the First Amendment. And it's like, really? Okay. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen show. That's right, this is just a clip. If you want the full show, you can go to KimIversonShow.com and you can watch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for about 1 hour. It's totally free. Check it out. KimIversonShow.com. Thanks for watching.